Okay, so we understand why keywords, particularly long tail keywords, can be important to our website. So now how do we actually start using these keywords? So like I mentioned previously, one way I like to think of keyword research is to imagine that there is someone in the world asking a question. They're looking for information and they're going to use a search engine to try to solve their problem. And since almost no one ever goes to page 2 of Google, Google basically has 10 chances to try to convince this person that Google is the best index of information in the world. So, of all the pieces of content in the world that could potentially answer this searcher's question, we use SEO to try to tell Google, hey, my website has what that guy wants. Now, we have to go beyond just the numbers and the data here. Your job is to get into the mind of the person typing the keyword itself. You want to really understand what this person wants, what is their commercial intent. Now, that's not always easy to figure out, and your ability to do so is heavily dependent on your own knowledge of the niche itself. But in either case, at this point, we understand why keywords are important. Now, the question is, how do we actually use them in our content? How good does our content have to be? How thoroughly must we answer the searcher's question? And how do we even really know what the searcher wants? Okay, so that's the million-dollar question. And it's not the kind of question that Google or anyone can come right out and answer for you. So there is a heavy subjective nature to content creation, and there are lots of different types and formats of content on the internet. But to start off, I'm going to try to outline the kind of keyword-based content that you probably do not want to build. And hopefully, this will act as a kind of guidepost to set you in the right direction with your content creation efforts. So I hope at this point in your IM career, you are kind of aware that old school content creation tricks like keyword stuffing and text spinning, so those are not the kind of articles you want to post, articles that use those old tricks. So that should go without saying, but let's take a look at a much more subtle example of inappropriate content creation. Now, for those who don't know, Tim Carter started AskTheBuilder.com in 1995, and when AdSense came out, he started making really good money. And then Google started sending him heaps of traffic for years and years, and the AdSense team even used his website as a case study, which you can still actually see on the AdSense blog. And then all that suddenly changed for Tim after Google's now infamous Panda and Penguin algorithm updates. Tim did an interview with James Hussey of theaveragegenius.net where he talked about this whole debacle about losing his traffic and how he felt personally betrayed by Google and how he wants to take legal action against Google and how Google doesn't care about him anymore, etc., etc. Now, the interview itself is really entertaining, and I highly suggest you go over to the Average Genius website and listen to the whole thing. But the important takeaway here is that quality content is a very ethereal subject. AskTheBuilder.com was always hailed as the epitome of what had quality content website. It was a site in which Tim insisted that he never engaged in any sort of gray hat ranking techniques or any sort of link trading that supposedly gets you into trouble. And yet, in the big Google updates, Tim's site was sent to the back of the line. His search traffic now is merely a fraction of what it used to be. So this really surprised me when I first learned about what had happened. But then I started to really dive in and look at Tim's posts. Now, he does actually have a lot of great posts on his site, but he has a lot of questionable posts as well. So I'm going to offer my opinion here, just my own read of his content from a quality perspective. So have a look at this post by Tim entitled Build Deck. Now, a couple things should pop out at you at first glance here. First of all, have you ever been to the magazine rack at your local hardware store, flipped through a few pages, and then saw a post that was titled Build Deck? I mean, I haven't. I mean, as a title of a document, we can see right off the bat that this post title doesn't have a lot of panache, right? See, in his post title, both the meta title and the H1 tag of his page, Tim is merely using a keyword directly from the Google keyword tool. BuildDeck is searched for a few hundred times a month, and I can only assume that there was a period of time in this website's history in which Tim thought it was cogent to title his posts using keywords taken directly verbatim from the Google keyword tool. Now, for anyone who's been an SEO for a while, you've probably done this yourself at one point or another. I know I have. In the early days of content creation, a lot of us did, we'd simply take keyword phrases right out of the Google keyword tool and use them verbatim as the title of our article. But this is precisely what Google does not want you to do. Keywords usually are not article titles. That's why it looks so funny. So, okay, this title is kind of screwy and it's not even grammatically correct. But, okay, so how is his content? Well, Tim has created a lot of posts on his site in a kind of question answer sort of format. So you can see here, he kind of features a person asking a specific question, and then he responds to it in a sort of stream of consciousness sort of way. Now, the question we should ask ourselves is, does Tim's post fulfill the commercial intent of the searcher? In other words, if someone came to you one day and asked you, how do I build a deck? Do you think a wise choice of action would be to send them to Tim's post here? I mean, just glance at it. So do you think that this post by Tim really answers the question, how do I build a deck? So he's got about 900 words of content in which he gives a few tips on deck construction. He also has a couple of pictures of how not to build a deck. And then at the bottom right, he has a link to an ad selling his book on how to clean a deck. But does any of this content really fulfill the actual commercial intent of the searcher? So I would say no. And if I were building a deck and I stumbled upon this page, then I would probably just hit the back button on my web browser. And I'd start looking for a website that had more of a step-by-step guide to actual deck construction. And this is what you see at websites like the one at doityourself.com. See, I think it's pretty clear that this page is fulfilling the actual commercial intent, the actual spirit of the searcher's query, build deck. This is probably the type of content that the searcher is actually looking for. So if Google were to keep sending people to Tim's build deck page, then Google wouldn't be doing their job. All right, so the tragedy to understand here is that Tim actually knows how to build a deck. I mean, he actually has heaps of content on his website that answers various deck questions. So Tim could have, at one time, taken that content and consolidated it into a very long and comprehensive post in which he really does explain the process of how to build a deck. But instead, it appears what he did was what a lot of us did during the early content farm days. He just engaged in the rote production of content, primarily basing his efforts on one phrase from the Google keyword tool, in this case, the phrase build deck. And this ultimately really hurt him because what we learned in the Panda updates is basically a few bad apples spoil the bunch. In other words, creating these light, especially keywordy type posts like this that don't offer much value to Google's index can get your whole site into trouble. Okay, so there's my read on how not to create content, and hopefully this will keep you safe from getting yourself into the situation that Tim found himself in. Now, after all that, is my little speech here the sole reason why Tim experienced a loss of traffic during the algorithm updates? I mean, I don't know. We can never really know for sure. Most likely, when it comes to these things, there were probably a myriad of ancillary factors involved. But in any case, the moral of the story is if you want to curtail the probability of being booted from Google's index, then create real content that actually answers the user's question in a comprehensive way, and not merely content that features the user's keyword.